Hey guys, what's up? We have a new deck event that is based on characters and requires you to very specific rules for you to develop your deck by. Now, the intention of this event is to run as pure a deck as possible so that everyone gets the experience they need to understand and learn these new decks. This is meant more for casual players or beginners to find out new tips and strategies that they can use either within their duels or in the future. The deck lists include the Amazonas cards, which are by the Tyler sisters, and obviously there was that Shadow Rider as well, Tanya. This requires a main deck of at least 12 or more Amazonas cards, and your extra deck must contain 2 or more different Amazonas fusion monsters. You have the Ancient Gears, which were used by the Obelisk Force, and earlier by Dr. Crowler, that was in Yu-Gi-Oh! GX and Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5. Your main deck must contain 15 or more Ancient Gear monsters, and your extra deck must contain 7 or more different Ancient Gear monsters. Elemental Heroes are by Jane Yuki. That was also during Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. It requires in the main deck 5 or more different Elemental Hero cards, 1 or more Elemental Hero Neos, in tribute to obviously the second season, where he started using those, and has to have obviously his favourite spirit monster, the one and only Winged Karibo. You are forbidden also from using synchros or exceeds monsters within your extra deck. The next archetype is the Melodious, which were used by Zuzu Boyle. This was in Arc 5. The main deck must have 12 or more Melodious cards. There must be 8 or more different Melodious cards, and your extra deck must have 3 or more Melodious cards. The Sacred Beasts, which were used by Ubel, this was in the 3rd season, as well as in the original season used by the person who was just above Chancellor Shepard. I believe it was like a school inspector. In the main deck, it requires 2 or more Raphael, Lord of Phantasms, 2 or more Hamon, Lord of Striking Thunder, and 2 or more Uriah, Lord of Searing Flames, 2 or more Dark Summoning Beast, and 2 or more of the Fallen Paradise field spells. The next archetype is the Cyberdarks, which were used by Zane Truesdale as of the 2nd season of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. Your main decks require 10 or more Cyberdark cards, and 5 or more different Cyberdark cards. Keep in mind that there are only 5 actual Cyberdark monsters in the game, so you'll probably have to run at least 1 of each copy to meet this requirement. The next archetype is the Destiny Heroes, which were used by Aster Phoenix, another 2nd season of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX deck. The main deck requires 15 or more Destiny Hero cards, which is probably one of the easiest conditions to meet, considering you have quite a few of the Destiny Heroes. The next archetype is based on the Legendary Knights, which were used by Yugi Moto, Joey Wheeler, and Seto Kaiba. It requires in your main deck 1 or more of each Legendary Knight, 1 or more of the Eye of Timaeus, 1 or more the Fang of Critias, and 1 or more of the Claw of Hermos. It also needs 1 or more Legend of Heart, and in the extra deck, 1 or more Timaeus, the Knight of Destiny. The next archetype is Fright Fur and Fluffles. Obviously, they were used by Sora in the Arc 5 generation. Your main deck needs 15 cards in total that are a mixture of Fluffle and Edge Imps. You must have the next archetype is the Predaplants. This requires you to have in your main deck 12 or more Predaplant cards and your extra deck contains 5 or more plant cards. So these have to be the different ones. This was used by Yuri in Arc 5. He was an antagonist within the story. The next archetype are the cubics. This was used by a character in the Yu-Gi-Oh movie, the different dimensions one. This requires 7 or more different cubic monsters, 12 or more cubic monsters in total, 4 or more different cubic spell and trap cards, and 10 or more cubic spell and trap cards. The next archetype are the Lunar Lights. These were used by Serena in Arc 5. Your main deck needs 15 or more Lunar Light monsters, and the main deck needs 5 or more different Lunar Light monsters. The next archetype is the Vehicroids. These were used by Cyrus Truesdale. These require 6 or more different Roid monsters that aren't Speed Roid monsters, and you cannot use Synchro monsters. The next archetype are the Flower Guardians. These were used in Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5. This was used by a prisoner who was actually the boss of that prison. Your main deck needs 15 or more Flower Guardian monsters, with 10 being different, and your extra deck needs 3 or more Flower Guardian monsters. The next archetype are the Aesir. This was used by Team Ragnarok in the 3rd season of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. Your main deck needs 10 or more Nordic cards. Your extra deck needs at least 1 Thor, Lord of the Aesir, Loki, 1 or more Loki, Lord of the Aesir, and Odin, Father of the Aesir. The next archetype are the Synchros. This was used by the main character of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. This was obviously the 3rd generation, and this was used by Yusei Fudo. Your main deck must contain 8 or more different cards from among the following types: Junk, Synchros, and Warriors, except Symphonic Warriors. Your main deck must contain 10 or more cards from among the following: Junk, Synchron, and Warriors, again except Symphonic Warriors, and your extra deck must contain at least 1 Stardust Dragon and 1 Shooting Star Dragon. The next archetype are Plants. These are by Akiza, again another main character within Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. Your main deck must contain 10 or more plant-type monsters, with 5 of them being Rose cards. For example, you have Rose Witch and Rose Fairy. Your extra deck contains 1 or more Black Rose Dragon and 1 or more Stardust Dragon. The next archetype are the Malefics. These were used in the second Yu-Gi-Oh! Movie. This was the bonds between the duelists. This was used by the main antagonist. This was Paradox. Your main deck must contain 10 or more Malefic cards. The next archetype are the Speedroids. These were used by Yugo in Arc 5. Your main deck must contain 6 or more different Speedroid monsters. Your main deck must contain 15 or more Speedroid monsters. Your extra deck must contain at least 1 Clearwing Synchro Dragon. Your extra deck must also contain at least 1 High Speedroid monster. The next archetype is the Super Heavy Samurais. These were used by Gong Strong or something along those lines. Your main deck must contain at least 25 or more Super Heavy Samurai cards, and your main deck must contain only monster cards. That is in keeping in how they play, in that they cannot use their abilities, if there are any spell or trap cards in your graveyard. The next cards for the archetype are for the Morphtronics. These were used by Leo, who was in Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. Your main deck must contain 15 or more Morphtronic cards. The next archetype are the Blackwings, used by Crow Hogan, another character within Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. Your main deck contains 8 or more different Blackwing cards. The next archetype are the Resonators. These were used by Jack Atlas, another character within Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. Your main deck must contain 6 or more different Resonator cards. Your main deck must contain 12 or more Resonator cards. Your extra deck must contain at least 1 Red Dragon Archfiend. Your extra deck must contain at least 1 Red Nova Dragon. The next archetype are the Gimmick Puppets. These were used in Yu-Gi-Oh! Zeal. Your main deck must contain 15 or more Gimmick Puppet cards. The next archetype are the Shark. This was used by Shark, or as he was also known in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Zeal, Reginald Castle. Your main deck must contain 6 or more different Shark cards. Your main deck must contain 12 or more Shark cards, and your extra deck must contain 3 or more different Shark cards. The next set of cards are for the archetype known as Onomatopoeia. This was used by Yuma Tsukumo. I've never honestly actually heard them be called that before. Don't know whether that's just people calling them that, or whether that was just invented for them, just to give them a classification. This was the main character of Yu-Gi-Oh! Zeal, and your main deck must contain 10 or more Zubababa, Gagaga, Go-Go-Go, and or Dododo cards. I feel really stupid for saying those, but those are actually archetypes for those of you who aren't aware of them. Your extra deck must contain at least 1 number 39 Utopia. It's a key card, so it has to be there. Your extra deck must contain at least 1 number C39 Utopia Ray. Again, because it was used as a more advanced version of Utopia, it was used to combat a lot of problems. The next archetype is the Harpies. These were used by My Valentine. This was in the original series of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters. Your main deck must contain 10 or more Harpy cards. The next archetype are the Phantom Knights. These were used by Yuto. This required your main deck to have 4 or more different the Phantom Knight cards. There are also spell and traps, so it's not too difficult to meet that requirement. Your main deck contains 12 or more different the Phantom Knight cards, and your main deck contains 6 or more Phantom Knight cards. The next archetype are the Galaxy Eyes. These was used by Kite Tenjo, who was originally a rival to Yuma in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Zeal series, the 4th series. It requires your main and extra decks combined to have 25 or more cards from among the following: Photon, Galaxy, and Cypher. Now, this actually provides you with more flexibility than most of the other options currently seen, as typically they made distinctions between the main deck and the extra deck. Here, you have more choice to say, okay, if I want to put more of these cards in my extra deck, then I can allot some more varied cards within my main deck, or vice versa. Your main deck must contain 1 or more Orbital 7. That was his assistant who used to help him capture the number cards. And your extra deck cannot contain Constellar Pleiades or Divine Dragon Knight Felrand. These were 2 cards that were often seen within the deck just as tech cards, and they weren't actually used by him at all within the series. The next archetype are the Heraldic Beasts. These were used by Tron, who was a smaller villain within the Yu-Gi-Oh! Zeal. Your main deck must contain 8 or more different Heraldic cards, and your main deck must contain 15 or more Heraldic cards. The next archetype are the Rank Up Magic. This was used by Nash, or it turns out to actually be the variation, the Baryon variation on Reginald Castle. Your main deck must contain 7 or more rank up magic cards. Wow, that is quite tricky to play and to pull off, because you could technically be just blocking your hand with all these rank up cards. If you have nothing to rank up, then they will be very dead in your in your hand. Your extra deck must contain 3 or more different cards from among the following: cards whose names include number but must be between number 101 to number 107, and Chaos exceeds Baryon Hope. Now, because he was the leader of the Baryons, that is justification for why you would need to run these. The next archetype are the Raid Raptors. This was used by Shun, who was of the Xyz dimension, along with Yuto in Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5. Your main deck monsters can only be Raid Raptor monsters, so you cannot splash in Blackwings or any other, dark variation synergy cards. You must use 5 or more different rank-up magic spell cards. Very much like the Xyz monsters, that's how this deck likes to play. It likes to go into something, and then it will just rank itself up to either double its rank or something along those lines. And your extra deck must contain 4 or more different Raid Raptor monsters. Not very difficult, considering that this is what it was designed around anyway. The next archetype are the Lyrical Lucinias. This was used by Ren, who is actually Shun's sister, who was actually captured within the fusion dimension. It requires your main deck to contain 3 or more Lyrical Lucinia monsters. Your main deck must contain 7 or more Lyrical Lucinia monsters, and your extra deck must contain 2 or more Lyrical Lucinia monsters. The next archetype are the Abyss Actors. This was used by a relatively minor and annoying character within Arc 5. I can't remember his name offhand. You can use 15 or more Abyss Actor cards, and you must use 6 or more Abyss Script cards. The next set of cards for the archetype are the Yusenjus, used again by the same character. He was very much indecisive on how he was playing his cards. He originally used this actually before the Abyss Actors, and I think Abyss Actor ended up being his, last stand deck, which he actually decided, okay, that's going to be his deck. It requires your main deck to have at least used 10 or more Yusenju cards. Your main deck must contain 2 or more Yusenju Shinchu L, and your main deck must contain 2 or more Yusenju Shinchu R cards. These are both pendulum cards, so it forces you to run the pendulum engine for them. The next archetype are the Cyverse type. This is one of the most up-to-date ones, with obviously Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains just coming out probably 6 months ago within the Japanese. Your main deck's monsters can only be Cyverse type. That's not a problem. You have a flood of them, and you've had the Link Structure deck. You have so many of these cards running around, it's not that difficult. And your extra deck can only consist of Link monsters. Again, not a problem. You do have more Link monsters flooding around, so it's not too difficult. Now, the next archetype is for Go Onizuka, and it's the Gokis. He is a main rival of Yusaku, and your main deck must contain 4 or more different Goki monsters. Your main deck contains 10 or more Goki monsters in total, and your extra deck can only contain Link monsters. This is probably more difficult to get through in comparison to the Cyverse types, as there are fewer Goki monsters in the game at the moment, so your choices are going to be slightly restricted. The next archetype are for the Trickstars that were used by Aoi Zaizen. Your main deck must contain 4 or more different Trickstar monsters. Your main deck contains 10 or more Trickstar monsters. Your extra deck can only contain link monsters, and most importantly of all, you cannot use Droll and Lockbird. This is used to shut down people searching. It's a hand trap that most players are looking to either pick up or they have, and they're using to try and tackle their opponent's effects. But the whole idea of this is to try and engage you with the deck itself. The whole purpose of it is to pretty much burn your opponent to death using small incremental amounts through chaining of about 200 life points each. But if you get something around like 14 or 15 chains, you could be looking about like 3,000 points of damage, which is always a useful thing to be doing. The next archetype is the Rockets. They were used by Revolver, who is a villain in the anime of Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains. You must use 3 or more different rocket monsters. You must use 7 or more rocket monsters. Your main deck must contain 1 or more Cracking Dragon, and your extra deck must contain 1 or more Borreload Dragon, that being the boss monster. The next archetype are the Altergeists. This was used by Emma Besho. Your main deck must contain 6 or more different Altergeist cards. Your main deck contains 15 or more Altergeist cards, and your extra deck must contain 1 or more Altergeist Prime Banshee. That's obviously her boss monster. The next archetype are the Magicians. It's Supreme King Zark. You must use 2 or more of the following cards: Astrograph Magician, Chronograph Magician, Double Iris Magician, Black Fang Magician, White Wing Magician, Purple Poison Magician, and your extra deck must contain 1 or more Supreme King Zark. That is quite a mouthful to get through. That is very specific, and is probably more specific than any of the other decks we've seen in terms of requirements so far. The next archetype is the Insect type. This was used by Weevil Underwood, a classic deck that has received some support, so maybe if we get that support in the right time, you could probably run that alongside these. Your main deck must contain 5 or more cards from among the following: Insect Queen, Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth, and or Cocoon of Evolution. Take it from me, you don't really want to be using Cocoon of Evolution. Keep it to Insect Queen and Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth. The reason for this is that there is a spell card that works in the same means as Cocoon of Evolution that allows you to bring out either of those 2 boss insect monsters, with them being able to ignore the summoning conditions. So you can have a very decent attacking monster or a very good effect monster to place on the field to threaten your opponents. The next archetype is the Water Dragons, and this was used by Bashin Misawa in Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. You must have 2 or more Water Dragon, 2 or more Water Dragon Cluster, 2 or more Deuteron, 2 or more Oxygeddon, 2 or more Hydrogeddon, and 2 or more Bonding H2O. Unfortunately, his deck is very specific, so as much as you might not want to be running these, you'd have to be running this variation anyway. The next archetype are the Performer Pal Sky Magicians, which were used by Yusho Sakaki, which is the main character's father, Yuya Sakaki. This was in Arc 5. You must use 2 or more Performer Pal Sky Magician. Your main deck must contain 3 or more different Magician continuous spell cards. Your main deck must contain 6 or more Magician continuous spell cards. Your main deck can only contain Performer Pal and Magician monsters, which is the most important part. The next archetype is the Ojamas. This was used by Chaz Princeton in the first season of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. Your main deck must contain 10 or more Ojama or Oja Muscle cards. This has also received some recent support, which has actually turned round the deck. Ojamas are no longer a tier 6-7 deck. They are doing very well, and there are no other restrictions, so the whole things about Exceed summoning or going into link monsters is very applicable in this case. The next archetype are the Divine Beasts. These are the Egyptian god cards. These were used by Marek Ishtar, Seto Kaiba, and Yugi Moto, obviously within the second series of Yu-Gi-Oh! The original series, which was in Battle City. Your main deck must contain 5 or more among the following: Slifer the Sky Dragon, Obelisk the Tormentor, and or the Winged Dragon of Ra. Now, the best way to do this is to probably have in 2 and 2 of one, of 2 of them, and have 1 of the other. Otherwise, you're just going to be bricking up your hands, and you cannot use pendulum monsters. Why is this key? Well, pendulum monsters shove a load of monsters onto the field. If you're going back to the whole, normal tributing, waiting, setting, summoning in order to bring them out properly, you cannot use pendulum monsters, which makes it completely understandable. The next archetype are the entertainments, or the performer pal, as they are called in the TCG. These were used by Yuya Sakaki, which was also another set of cards used within Arc 5. Your main deck must contain at least 1 Odd Eyes Dragon, a Stargazer Magician, Time Gazer Magician, Smile World, and your main deck's monsters can only be Odd Eyes, Performer Pal, and or Magician monsters. This is to go back to the traditional format of when he first discovered his pendulum summoning. The first pendulums he got out were Time Gazer and Stargazer. So it's just to follow along with that. The next archetype are the Silent, which were used by Yugi Moto. This was in the... I don't actually think they were used that often. I think they started to see some sort of use within either the 3rd or the 4th series. I'm not too sure of that. I know they were definitely used in the last duel between Yugi and the Pharaoh. Your main deck must contain 3 or more different silent cards. So you've got Silent Magician, you've got Silent Swordsman, and I think there's another silent somewhere along the lines. Your main deck contains 6 or more silent cards, and your main deck's monsters can only be Warrior type, Spellcaster type, or Fairy type. The next archetype are the Cyber Style, which are used by Ryu Marufuji. I'm not sure who that is. But it says that your main deck must contain 10 or more Cyber Machine type monsters. I believe that might be Professor Chancellor Shepard, as he used Cyber Ogre in his duel in the 2nd series against Zane, when Zane had got very gothic and had wanted to steal the Cyberdark monsters. The next archetype are the Cyber Angels. These were used by Alexis Rhodes. This was in the 2nd and 3rd series of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. And the deck must contain 5 or more different Cyber Angel monsters. Your deck must contain 8 or more Cyber Angel monsters in total, and your deck contains 3 or more Machine Angel cards. Next archetype are the Time Lords. This was used by Zone. This requires your main deck to contain 11 or more Time Lord cards, and your extra deck cannot contain Synchro monsters. This was the main villain at the end of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. It was never dubbed in English, but you can go and check it out yourself. These cards worked on being summoned. They were level 10 monsters. You summon them normally, but at the end of your opponent, I think it was your opponent's turn, they go back to your hand. The next archetype are the Gate Guardians. These are used by the Paradox brothers when they dueled against Yugi and Joey. They were the eliminators on the island in Duelist Kingdom, as well as they had a 2-part episode, 10 and 11, for Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, which Crowler tried to get Jaden and Cyrus expelled for. They must contain 2 or more Suijin, Kazujin, Sangha of the Thunder, and Gate Guardian. These are all the key cards they were using, and you cannot use Pendulum Monsters, in the same reason that, if you mass summon cards, you can meet their levels very easily. You could pretty much spat out the 3 necessary cards and then sacrifice them for Gate Guardian. That is not the initial design of the cards. The next archetype are the Prediction Princess. This was used by a relatively minor character that was in Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5. You use 5 or more different Prediction Princess monsters. You use 10 or more Prediction Princess monsters. The next archetype are the Destiny Board. This was used by Yami Bakura back in not Duelist Kingdom, Battle City, near the final stage. You must use 2 or more Dark Necrophere, and your deck must aim for winning using the condition Destiny Board. The next archetype are the Twilight Ninjas. These were used by a couple of brothers who were in the Arc 5 anime. Your main deck must contain 3 or more different Twilight Ninja monsters. Your main deck must contain 6 or more Twilight Ninja monsters. Your main deck must contain 3 or more different ninjutsu art trap cards, and your main deck must contain 6 or more ninjutsu art trap cards. The next archetype is for the DDs, which was used by Declan Akaba. Your main deck can only contain monsters that are DD or DDD monsters. This was a character within Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5 as well. The next archetype are the Legendary Fishermen. This was used by Meiku Tsunami within both Duelist Kingdom and in the Battle City. You must use 2 or more the Legendary Fishermen, 2 or more the Legendary Fisherman 2, and 2 or more the Legendary Fisherman 3. There cannot be any cards in your extra deck, so you must focus on using just these as your key boss monsters, along with probably some other boss monsters if you feel like. The next archetype is for the Toons. These were used by the creator of cards himself, Maximilian Pegasus. It says that your main deck must contain 10 or more Toon cards, and or including Manga Riran, as it is technically a Toon. The next archetype are the Destruction Swords. These weren't directly used by Yami Yugi, but they were a variation on the Buster Blader archetype, so you must use 6 or more different Destruction Sword cards in your main deck. You must use 12 or more Destruction Sword cards in your main deck, and you must use 3 Buster Blader. The next archetype are the Fortune Ladies. This was used by Carly Carmine. She was a character within the Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. She was infatuated with Jack Atlas, and unfortunately, because of her curiosity as a journalist, she got herself into some trouble trying to face Saya, who was the leader of the Arcadia movement, the group of members that consisted of psychic-based users who had telekinetic abilities, and she ended up falling down and being revived falling out of a tower, being revived as a Dark Signer. These require your main deck to contain 12 or more Fortune Lady monsters in the main deck in total. There are currently 6 different versions, so you could be running 2 of all of them if you wish, or you could be running multiples of certain ones and less on others. The next archetype is the Dark Magician and Gaia the Fierce Knight. This was used by Yami-Yugi in the original series and onwards from that. Your main deck must contain 10 or more cards related to Dark Magician or Gaia the Fierce Knight, and you must use 1 or more Karibo. Obviously that's his spirit monster, so you would expect that to be there. The next archetype is the Blue Eyes White Dragons. This is used by Seto Kaiba right from the beginning, episode 1. Your main deck must contain 15 or more cards related to Blue Eyes White Dragon. So I'm guessing things like Spirit Dragon, Alternative White Dragon. But out of everything, this is probably the least clarified out of, all the other texts are very easy to decipher. This is something maybe which could be raised as an argumentative point to officials. I'm sure they will have some sort of clarification of how that's going to work. Your deck must contain 1 or more Obelisk the Tormentor. That's obvious. It's just in response to him having that one time where he was running Obelisk during Battle City until he lost it to Yugi. The next set of cards are the Crystal Beasts, used by Jesse Anderson, and your main deck must contain 15 or more Crystal Beast cards. That's just cards in general. There are so many spell traps, and you have 7 monsters. So that means you can run, any variations you wish, and you have a lot of flexibility on them. The next archetype are the Magician Girls, used by Yugi Moto. You can use 4 or more different Magician Girl monsters, and you can use 12 or more Magician Girl monsters. This was used in the Dark Side of Dimensions movie, and was his own variation on his deck. That's not too specific. There are about 5 of them, I believe. So you might have to run each of them, but each of them work very well, synergize with each other, so it's not a problem. The last archetype are the Red Eyes, obviously used by Joey Wheeler. He gained his Red Eyes from defeating a Rex Raptor in a duel which was in risk of his Time Wizard. Your main deck must contain 6 or more different Red Eyes cards. Your main deck must contain 12 or more Red Eyes cards. So what do you think of this type of event? I personally enjoy the idea, as you have the increase of more generic cards within the game that people like to splash into every deck. However, this tries to get people to step back a bit to make as close to the purist build of these decks as possible, whilst maintaining enough room for people's creativity to let people experience how to play the deck. There is also enough character support for most decks in order to play them at least decent power, with the small exception to a deck like Cyber Darks, which unfortunately they only have about 5 standard monsters, and 2 of which were introduced about a year ago. So, you've got the risks of they've got a very simplistic means of playing, so you can counter that a lot easier than you would with something like Fluffles. So which deck will you be playing, and which deck will you want to face against the most? Leave your comments down below, like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe, click the bell for notifications, and as always, thank you for taking the time to watch this. And